Well, welcome everybody to the June 2021 session of the ELGA webinar series. We're delighted to have you with us either on Zoom or on Facebook Live. Today's topic is an update on 5 ecological law case studies, building on a webinar we had at the beginning of last year explaining this approach. And since that time in February 2020, we put together 5 teams that have been working to apply these principles of ecological law into actual situations. And we're very, very pleased today to be with you to give you that update. So today's topic is an update on these 5 ecological case studies, and they involve, as you can see, the effects of the St. Lawrence Seaway on the Mohawks of Ganawake in Canada, a proposed phosphate mining operation on Itápolis, Brazil, efforts to restore River Ethiop in Nigeria, the application of ecological law to biodiversity on the high seas, and how ecological law would change the way we treat wildlife in Vermont. Just as a reminder, one thing that we've tried to use consistently is common principles of ecological law, and these are very nicely captured in Carla Spert's Lens of Ecological Law, in which she puts 3 ideas at the center of ecological law: ecocentrism, which is recognizing and respecting the value of all beings and the interconnectedness among them, equitably promoting the interests of human and non-human members of the Earth community; ecological primacy, which is ensuring that social and economic behavior and systems are ecologically bound, respecting planetary boundaries; and ecological justice, which is ensuring equitable access to the Earth's sustaining capacity for present and future generations of humans and other beings, and avoiding the inequitable allocation of environmental harms. When we do these ecological law case studies, basically we're looking at the entire legal regime that surrounds a particular situation, and then we deconstruct it not only into the application of environmental law to the situation, but all laws. So property law, labor law, local, regional, national, and international law. Some of our cases, as you'll hear, put these situations in an international context. Then we analyze the case using the lens of ecological law to see what about the situation appears to be consistent with an ecological approach to law and what would need to change. And then we reconstruct the situation under a regime of ecological law. And in many cases, we'll look at a near-term transitional scenario in which we're moving towards ecological law. But since that is such a profound and long-term effort, that might be different from the ultimate solution that we envision through the application of ecological law in a particular case. So that's all I'm going to do by way of introduction. We'll get right into the case studies, and we'll start with Professor Sarah Reiter from the Vermont Law School. And take it away, Sarah.
Great, thank you. So I am trying to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it. And I apologize in advance if you hear trees or a dog barking, because there is tree removal happening where I am. Okay, great. So I want to take you today from California to the Clarion Clipperton zone in the bottom of the ocean. Neither of these are actually the high seas area, but I found as I was starting to deconstruct and reconstruct that it was really helpful to have tangible examples of already established networks of marine protected areas where there was a law in place, and get a sense for what went well, what could have been improved on as I look towards the draft treaty for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity on the high seas. So I want to thank you for allowing me to share alongside other thought leaders in this area. It's been quite enjoyable to do this academic exercise. So my inspiration and curiosity for looking at the new draft BBNJ treaty, the new High Seas Treaty, stems from tracking the negotiations over the past couple of years. I co-designed and developed workshops that I offered at Vermont Law, Dartmouth, and the University of Oxford with students, and created simulated negotiations for those students where they were reading the draft text of the treaty, as well as the textual proposals that parties were submitting. And this treaty is falling under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, under that umbrella treaty, and it is a package deal between developing nations and developed nations. There are four main parts of that treaty: capacity building and technology transfer, marine protected areas under area-based management tools, environmental impact statements, and marine genetic resources. Of those, Professor Kinvin Roth, one of my mentors, has already done an analysis of ecological law for the overall draft BBNJ treaty as it currently stands. The fourth and final meeting will be in August of this year for the overall treaty. So what I'm going to be doing is looking specifically at the high seas element of the treaty to get a sense of whether there's opportunity there with the lens of ecological law. So in order to deconstruct the environmental law and reconstruct with ecological, again, I wanted us to travel beneath the surface to the bottom of the ocean and off the coast of California to do that. Those are two site areas where I've done field research and have a bit more knowledge of how those networks of marine protected areas were designed, the timeline and process for doing so, and then also the implementation there. So what exactly is a marine protected area? It's an underwater seascape that's designed to protect key ocean habitats and species by managing activities, whether it's fishing or mining or other activities that could threaten the integrity of those seascapes. And you can manage that through either spatial or temporal regulation, for example, over different seasons, depending on whether there's migratory animals, or over a spatial extent as well. So most of my work as a lawyer has been working with spatial ecologists on establishing these marine protected areas. And the Clarion Clipperton zone in particular is one of my favorite areas. It spans approximately 80% of the United States across. If you overlaid it on the continental United States, you would see it going from California all the way to the eastern seaboard. And this area is a pretty fascinating area of the abyssal Pacific that is governed as part of the area. So this area, it has deep sea ecosystems that provide several ecosystem services: carbon sequestration, nutrient cycling, and other ecosystem services, extensive marine biodiversity that we're still learning about the species that we're finding there. And it's also home to polymetallic nodules. You can see those, the hockey puck looking things that are under the very cool species that you see. And they, there's a ton of minerals that are in this area. So there's actually already been extensive exploration of deep sea mining in this area. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So the governance structure that we have at the bottom of the ocean when we're extending beyond national jurisdiction is different for the water column and the surface of the water on the high seas, which will be the BBNJ treaty, and this, which is the area, which is the seabed and the ocean floor and subsoil thereof beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. Here, the principle of the common heritage of mankind applies, whereas in the water column and the surface of the water, the principle of freedom of the seas applies. So there's going to be often what is referred to as dueling legal principles between the water column and what we have at the bottom of the ocean. Nevertheless, even though this is not the principle that will apply for the high seas, there's a lot we can learn from what happened in trying to establish networks of marine protected areas here. So again, with the common heritage of mankind, the principle is based on the idea that resources should be accessible to all, the seabed belongs to everyone, and that all can profit by it. So the Law of the Sea Treaty sets up in its provisions, it stands up the International Seabed Authority, which is responsible for regulating all actions on the bottom of the ocean. And the International Seabed Authority has this really challenging dual mandate of both protecting this area and the marine environment at the same time as having a responsibility to exploit this area. So there has already been a process for prospecting and exploration and moving in towards exploitation and the regulations associated with those. So I was pulled into this work in 2015, actually, based on work I had been doing with scientists. I had worked with some spatial ecologists that had been involved in workshops in 2007. You can see over there on the left-hand side about the MPA design principles, primarily based on the scientific information we need to make sure that these networks of protected areas where there will be no mining are close enough in their connectivity that you can actually have the population connectivity that you need. So scientifically based recommendations is the column that you can see with the little squares. And then overlaid over that, you can see where there are already exploration claims that had been permitted by the International Seabed Authority. So when my colleague showed me what was happening in the International Seabed Authority in 2015 was about to meet to start discussing its exploitation regulations, and we looked at this, we recommended that the International Seabed Authority consider placing a stay on exploration and exploitation and use workshops to develop networks of nature preserves on the bottom of the ocean, relying on the scientific expertise, because what we found is if you already have claims at the bottom of the ocean, it undermines the ability of the networks to do what they're supposed to do. This work was published in Science and it gained pretty decent traction in advance of those meetings, yet exploration and exploitation of the seafloor continues. And so I started thinking about this in terms of thinking about the lens of ecological law and the common heritage of mankind and what we have here. And because we have this mandate specifically written in for the International Seabed Authority to exploit resources on the bottom of the ocean for humankind, that is at odds with the plethora of biodiversity that you're seeing at the bottom of the ocean and other things that we haven't yet discovered. That the constitution of the ocean, the law of the sea, is anthropocentric at its core. It's really based on, this conversation between coastal nations and landlocked nations, trying to establish how we're going to govern this commons. And the experience of establishing this network demonstrates that exploration claims is valued over the interconnectedness of all beings, including those living on or above the abyssal Pacific and not yet discovered. In terms of primacy, the very act of disturbing the seafloor is going to release carbon sequestration, and that dual mandate, again, to protect from pollution while also exploiting the deep sea, fails to provide a legal arrangement that can constrain the material and energy use within ecological limits. So there are some real challenges with the way that this governance system is set up as it stands, and that will be an issue when we're looking at the high seas. And then in terms of ecological justice, again, this is at odds with the scientific information and the precautionary principle that we advocate for. And in tandem with the exploitation of the seafloor, there's a failure to ensure equitable access to the Earth's sustaining capacity for present and future generations. Because again, we don't know the unintended consequences of these plow cuts of scooping up the polymetallic modules. So I know I don't have a lot of time, but I also wanted to jump in and describe California because I think the juxtaposition between the two can be really interesting. So the coastal California, the network of marine protected areas in California was the first statewide network of marine protected areas in the United States. There was an initiative that occurred from 2004 to 2012. There was implementing legislation, the Marine Life Protection Act initiative, and a public-private partnership also to provide the financing to mobilize this process. It was based on 6 primary goals, and it occurred in a regional phased approach of 4 different regions of California, starting, I believe, with the Central Coast and ending with the North Coast. And this is hailed in marine protected area literature as one of the best examples of establishing a network of marine protected areas, in part because it was really based on those scientific goals and because there was a really robust public planning process that was involved. But at the same time, it's been interesting in the last couple of years, there's been a recognition that there were some things that law did not help with. And that in particular was the inclusion of tribes. So tribal activities, because there was no statutory support, the resource managers, the agencies considered tribal activities, sacred activities activities as recreational uses. And so when certain uses were banned, sacred uses of the tribes were banned alongside that. And so there was a really transformative effect of tribal advocacy on state governance. And the state actually came out with an executive order on including the inclusion of tribes, both federally recognized and not recognized, to make sure that the tribes had adequate representation in the development and the monitoring and implementation of the marine protected areas going forward. So again, what we learned from this is, in terms of thinking about both human and non-human, we had human members of the Earth community that were not taken adequately into consideration. So that was already a challenge. The state has a learned commitment based on that experience and is working towards that. At the same time, I think there's a lot of opportunity for folding in traditional ecological knowledge into that element of ecocentrism going forward. I would say in terms of primacy, this law was much better than when we look at the law of the sea, because you don't have that dual mandate between exploitation and protection. It was very much based on the purpose of this is to scientifically make sure that we have sustainable resources within our marine protected areas going forward. So I think it does much better in that area, although I think there's still room for improvement. And then in terms of ecological justice, again, this was one of the major challenges because of the failure to include tribes and include the tribes appropriately. And so how do we make sure that we're able to do that going forward? So the next thing that I will do is take the lessons learned from the bottom of the ocean and from California and apply that to part 3 of the BBNJ treaty, which will be the biodiversity on the high seas. That's the particular part that's specific to marine protected areas. The 4th and final, hopefully final meeting will be in August of this year. And so my hope is to be able to have final text that I can analyze towards that and use the lessons that I've learned from studying the CCZ and California. And I just wanted to give a shout out to colleagues at the various institutions who have been helpful in inspiring this work. And I'll go ahead and stop.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for starting us off on that really great analysis of how these ideas apply to, in a very particular, and maybe not the first thing you'd think of. So I'm so glad that your case study is part of this group of studies. We'll now turn to Brazil, and Gabriela, I'll turn it over to you to introduce your team and make your presentation.
So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. My name is Gabriela. I speak for the Ecological Case Law Study from Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina in Brazil. It's an honor to be able to share this important panel with such great researchers and with such great inspirations. For a brief summary of our case law study, we'd like to present to you Untitled, a small town with a population of 3,259 inhabitants and an agriculture-based economy. Untitled is located in the state of Santa Catarina, 85 kilometers from Florianópolis, where our university is located. As you can see on the map, Florianópolis is an island, but Untitled is located in a mountain range, an area of diversified vegetation with several springs. A large area of Untitled was expropriated due to the phosphate deposits, but it was never explored. This expropriation caused damage to the town and the residents. The main reason is that the most fertile land is in the expropriated area, and as we said before, Untitled economy is based on agriculture. More than 30 years ago, a Brazilian research company started to study the land, and about 10 years ago, the Bunge company took control of the area and applied for a license to install an extraction mine and a sulfuric acid factory. Both substances added to sulfur would become fertilizer. The company, the Bunge company, is one of the 5 multinational companies that owns phosphate production in Brazil, along with Phosphero, Copperbras, Ultrafertile, and Serrana. Copperbras belongs to the English multinational Anglo-American. Ultrafertile is controlled by Phosphero, which is awaiting a judicial decision on merger by Bunge. Serrana also belongs to Bunge. Adbustrevo belongs to the multinational Yara that was also interested in the area of Untitled. Back to our case, environmentalists created the NGO Montanha Viva, in English, Living Mountain, to warn about the risks of these projects, since the areas are of permanent preservation, including the Atlantic forest, and also the habitat of many endangered species. Furthermore, it would also contaminate the soil and the hydrographic basin of the region. I prepare here a timeline of the judicial action, because in 2009, the Institute of the Environment of the state of Santa Catarina, at the time the name was FETMA, granted a prior license for Bunge to the extraction of phosphate from the region. This prior license was about the suppression of hectares of Atlantic forest and also for the implementation of tailings dam almost 95 meters high. According to the NGO Montanha Viva, the studies presented by Bunge were superficial and did not show the real impacts. So the NGO filed a lawsuit against the Bunge company, along with the town, the state of Santa Catarina, the Federal Union, FATMA, the Environmental Institute IBAMA, and other co-authors that joined the active poll in the course of the public civil action. The purpose of this lawsuit was to prevent the implementation of the superphosphate manufacturing complex in the rural area of the municipality of Anetapolis. It also aimed to the protection and defense of interests of the collectivity, seeking out the annulment of the prior environmental license. The lawsuit also aimed to stop the destruction of environmental protected areas and prevent other illegalities of municipal, state, and national laws. In the same year, there was a decision that partially granted the preliminary injunction to suspend the effects of the prior license until a final decision of the court. The judicial process took years, and the Federal Prosecution Service, the Public Defender Office, and several city halls joined alongside with the NGO. In 2016, a sentence was issued extinguished these disputes because Bunge withdrew the license process. But since the merits were not analyzed, the NGO appealed to the Superior Court of Justice to continue the judicial process until there was a final decision preventing the implementation of a mining project in Anetapolis. This is still a pending case. In a conversation of the lawyer Eduardo Moreira, he stated that the immediate goals are the reversal of the decision to dismiss the case without resolving the merits, or if not reverse it, the filing of a popular action, besides conducting public hearings before the final judgment on the merits. Furthermore, if the nation's judicial canons are exhausted without the desired protection, there is the possibility of trying to appeal to international courts. The Bunge company claims to have sold the area to Vale, the same multinational responsible for the environmental crimes in Mariana and Brumadinho, that I think that people may have the knowledge yet, because it was a real disaster. And Vale claims to negotiate with North American Mosaic Company, the largest US producer of potash and phosphate fertilizer. This is one of the three main areas we decided to address in this case law study. First, we analyzed how the environment perspective was presented in both macro and micro level of analysis. That is to say, in constitutional and international mechanisms and state and municipal law. We have not yet entered other levels of legislation, but we understand how the ecological perspective guides the law as a whole, not only environmental law. Hereinafter, according to ecological law, we reviewed those analysis levels nowadays, projecting what they could be with an ecocentric hermeneutic. Finally, we utilized the colonial studies to comprehend the role of multinational companies in our country. So in the macro level of analysis, we observed that the way the environment is treated in our constitution is very advanced compared to most developed nations, even at present days, when our federal government tends to be hostile in environmental areas. Brazil is an important role. Since 1988, our constitution refers to future generations, a term that appears in other judgments of 2009, associating the defense of environmental heritage to the quality of life of future generations. Nowadays, it is even more present with the advisory opinion 2317 of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that establishes the correlation between human rights, environmental, and sustainability. Article 225 of our federal constitution provides protection to the environment as everyone's right. It reads as follows: everyone has the right to an ecologically balanced environment, which is a public good for the people's use and is essential for a healthy life. the government and the community have a duty to defend and to preserve the environment for present and future generations. This protection provided by the Brazilian Constitution is not enough to observe ecological principles. Among many reasons, this is due to the possible understanding of public good as a resource available for commercial use because of the developmental character that can be interpreted in other articles of our Constitution. Thus, the intergenerational, interspecies, and interhuman aspects of ecological law are not taken into account, even if they are features present in the construction of the article. This presents a problem that even with provisions that are considered good and in accordance with international environmental law, there are always gaps that might be explored to violate the environment, hence the need to create a public good enforceable, especially in places where the environment is more affected by companies or corrupt governments, ensure that human development is ecologically bound. In this sense, in the micro level of analysis, we focus on three main problems that can be extracted for the case. The conflict of competences in environmental matters related to licensing and inspection organs, the granting of a prior environmental license, and the exploration of permanent preservation areas. We observe that most Brazilian doctrines refer to these matters as a way to protect environmental resources to the demands of a consumer society, or as the possibility of using environmental resources for the greatest number of people. From the placement of nature as an object or a mere resource, we can perceive an anthropocentric perspective. Further, at the same time that other authors understand that the objective of environmental licensing, inspection organs, and permanent preservation areas is the protection of the principles of the environment, it still lacks the hermeneutics of an ecological thought that perceives nature as a whole and the intergenerational impacts of its degradation. Therefore, even if we have the legal mechanisms to prevent the impacts of the degradation of an extraction mine in the sulfuric acid factory, in the case was still granted a prior environmental license for its construction. An ecological approach would comprehend the lack of need for another installation that harms the human-earth relationship. A good indication of this perspective is Santa Catarina State Law 17,895 from February of 2020 that establishes a zone free of exploitation of natural phosphate or phosphate rock derivatives and storage of sulfur subjected to chemical reactions aimed at the production of sulfuric acid. This new law even brings at its heart an observance of planetary boundaries. It makes us raise questions about other ways of living, creating, and producing through a system-based approach, which understands the need for areas without extraction of materials that are finite and can cause terrible damages such as phosphate. Finally, we address the Bunge Group Company that was founded in 1818, headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri, USA. The group presents itself as a company that connects the farms and the farms to the consumer's table, offering innovative and quality products and services. They claim that they operate in an integrated and sustainable manner in activities that complement each other, connecting farmers, producers, retailers, and consumers. Despite these beautiful purposes, it is important to emphasize that Bunge's foreign investment in countries like Brazil, and specifically in Annapolis, have characteristics of colonialism. Developed by Aníbal Quijano, the concept of coloniality of power expresses that the colonial relations in the economic and political spheres did not cease to exist with the destruction of colonialism. In the case of Annapolis, the exploitation of phosphate represents also what Boaventura calls social fascism, in which a social regime of extremely unequal power relations grants the stronger party the veto power over the weaker party's life and way of life. Of the 5 forms of social fascism presented by Boaventura de Souza Santos, we can point out territorial fascism. In this case, that is to say that social actors with strong patrimonial capital as Bunge Group Company remove the state from control of the territory in which they operate, co-opting or violating state institutions, starting to exercise social regulation. Even if the expropriated land was sold to another multinational group, in this case, the Mosaic Group, there is no difference with the colonial influence in relation to Brazilian land. Therefore, Even with all changes in law and interpretations, the anthropocentric perspective that understood the project as a positive influence for the economy by not perceiving environmental and social damages is still present nowadays. Thereby, we need an ecological law perspective and an ecological law approach that will truly enforce principles of integrity in communion with nature, learning with knowledge that transcends Western modernity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, to you and all of your team for bringing the ideas of ecological law, down to a small mountain town in Brazil and making the connections all the way up to the international level, both in terms of the present actors, like this company with now links perhaps to the United States, but also the legacy of colonialism in which a lot of these situations are embedded. So we'll see some similar things in our next case study. I think this is about the River Ethiop in Nigeria, and our colleagues Irikefidafe and Ngozi Unigbe will be presenting that case study. So I have their PowerPoint up.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are listening from. This is a case study with River Ethiop, Delta State, Nigeria. I'm presenting on behalf of Professor Ngozi Unigbe, University of Benin, Grant Wilson, Executive Director, Head Law Center, USA, Lamont, lawyer, and independent researchers, and Dr. Jove Gava of ELGA. I just want to thank you for this great opportunity. It is timely in the sense that we've been on this business of trying to restore and protect River Ethiop in the last 3 decades. And this concept of ecological law coming at this time, where we are at the point of trying to give right of nature to River Ethiop, it is a welcome development. I will just want to go straight to the presentation this evening. We're evening in Nigeria here, 5 p.m. Please, next slide. Current situation, definition of River Ethiop. River Ethiop is a spring-fed river in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria that flows from a hill in the community of Umuaja along the border of Delta State and Edo State to Sapele, where it finally joined the Atlantic Ocean through the Benin rivers. It has a catchment area of 2,500 square kilometers and about an estimated population of 2 million. And it is shared by 2 national river basin development authorities, and that is Benin Owena and Niger Delta River Basin Development Authorities. Next slide, please. This is the catchment map. It's not too clear, but it can be accessed through the appropriate link, which I will send to everybody after this presentation. Next, this is the major cities and town which the river passes through in 5 local government councils area in Delta states. Next slide. This is the tributaries contributing to River Ethiop, about 4 tributaries that contribute to River Ethiop and eventually end up in a Benin River through Sapele in Delta State. Next slide, please. The current economy of the state in Niger Delta area is dominated by oil and gas development since the discovery of major oil deposit in 1956, which generates considerable wealth for the country. Nonetheless, Nigeria, and particularly the state in Niger Delta region, suffer from the resource cost phenomenon, in that despite the richness in oil and gas and other hydrocarbon resources, poverty levels and environmental degradation continue rising on a daily basis. To a large extent, the cultural and the ways of the people has been converted from that of a riverine area to that of oil and gas culture. Next slide, please. Some of the reasons for the research calls are strong alliance of political elite with multinational and other economic actors in the oil and fossil fuel sector, such that the benefits or whatever that's accruing from the oil and gas in the regions never get to the people, and no evidence of anything good on ground that one can actually be pointed to. So what you see is poverty, conflict everywhere. And environmental degradation is one of the worst in the entire world. Next slide, please. So River Ethiopia then demonstrates a typical evidence of what is happening in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. The western part of river catchment is dominated by oil and gas facilities. And other area that's also you can find easily in the area as economic activity includes research development, hunting, farming, fishing, sand mining, illegally promoted by state actor. So River Ethiopia, as we know it, function as a source of food, water, spiritual homage, tourism, festival, peace, unity among the people. It's also a source for flood mitigation, climate change regulations, habitat for wildlife species, migration routes, reproduction sites, research and medicinal destination for many scientists all over the world. Next slide, please. However, environmental monitoring and data related to River Ethiopia is very, very slim. Known environmental issues confronting river and catchments include poor water qualities, loss of wetlands. Almost over 60% of traditional vegetations are almost gone. Loss of native vegetation biodiversity, infiltration of sound and seat, diversion of river courses for recreation, loss of natural flow due to invasive weed and cetacean, loss of river capacity to support traditional aquatic activities, such as swimming, bathing, and others. And this also includes oil and gas and other development agricultural activities such as wetland degradation due to illegal and uncontrolled mining, urban development and rising populations, stormwater runoff, climate change flooding, including deposits of contaminants and impact of tourism activities, which is mostly not controlled in the area. The legal framework. Like I said earlier, the faces of river you see today is as a result of legal forces at play. River Ethiopia is impacted primarily by the law, policies, and practices of the federal government, the government of Delta State and Edo State, and the government of the 5 local government councils through which the river passes through. Overall, the legal regime in the Niger Delta regions at both the state, federal, and international levels support the dominant oil economy of the area. Article 20 of the Constitution states, the state shall protect and improve the environment and safeguard the water, air and land, forests, and wildlife of Nigeria. But this is not justifiable according to Article 6 of the same constitutions. Despite many federal and state environmental laws and regulations that exist in Nigeria, River Ethiopia continues to go worse and worse on a yearly basis because these laws are not enforced appropriately. Although regulations and institutions exist to take care of River Ethiopia, such as National Water Resource Institute and River Basin Development Authorities, both created in 1976 and 1986. The Federal Ministry of Water Resources created in 1997. The Federal Ministry of Environmental Agency created in 1998, now Federal Ministry of Environment. the National Environmental Standard and Enforcement Agency, created in 2007, the Water Resource Decree and the Land Use Decree. Ownership and control of water resources under federal law, particularly in 1993 decree, is tied to land ownership and applied to both surface and groundwater. Legal provision to deal with over-appropriations, especially of groundwater, and customary law are complicated and ineffective for ensuring that land use does not cause environmental harms. Customary rights usually can be superseded by statutory rights, although there are open questions, and the federal government and state can extinguish customary rights in the public interest, which include oil pipeline and mining activities. Corruption and greed, combined with threats and intimidation against people working to reform and expose corruption or to promote environmental protection and social justice, also impede and affect legal regime for protecting the vital and its catchment. Over 80% of state and federal budget revenue is from the oil sectors. This gives the government a strong incentive to protect the industry to maintain its revenue streams. So, applying the ecological lens based on what I have just said, we look at it from an ecocentric viewpoint to start with, that the current legal and institutional framework that apply to the vital and its catchment is highly human-centered, and there needs to be a drastic change to this. Looking at it from ecological premises, the current legal and institutional framework that apply to the vital and its catchment does not give primacy in the law to respecting and keeping human activity within the bounds of ecological limits. And to some extent, such primacy, if exists, is not well implemented and enforced. Ecological justice. The current legal and institutional framework that apply to the vital and its catchment is very weak on ecological justice, in that it does not ensure intergenerational, intragenerational, and interspecies fairness and justice. As a result, rate of poverty, lack of well-being in human community in the catchment are high, and the wealth extracted from oil development goes elsewhere. Harm to aquatic species is ongoing, and other species in the catchment face declining abundance and diversities. The Vital Trust Foundation was established in April 1992. And our efforts since then has been encouraging. Remember, we are dealing in a society where there is a high level of poverty and ignorance. So it takes us almost 10 years to convince the key primary stakeholders of what we are trying to do. Of course, what is primary in this area of Nigeria is they want to get out of poverty. So they don't really care if the vital is sacrificed to achieve that goal of escaping poverty. But we deemed it fit that destroying the vital to escape from poverty will cause more poverty and suffering for the people. So we insisted that despite the resistance of the people to our effort, that we must go ahead to ensure that the vital is protected for the present and future generations. So after 2 decades, they gradually begin to understand our missions. And right now, they are cooperating. In 2020, in January 2021, the key stakeholder, which covers both the indigenous people, the government, the business, came together and declared the right of revival, which is now to be implemented through the State House of Assembly and the Federal House of Assembly before the end of this year. So the future prospects, effort of Red Fund, Revital Transportation are the both of futures. So what is hope for catchment-wide is already happening at the small scale. We have demonstrated our activity in some communities along the bank of the rivers, and we are using it as a case study and as an advocacy point to advance to the whole catchment of the river. B, ecocentric approach. Right of Rivertube, we put the river and its the proposed right of Rivertube. We put the river and its ecosystem on equal plane with the people, communities and business and corporation who rely on or have an impact on the river. Core principle of interconnectedness and holistic system-based thinking about the river and ecosystem become dominant. In 2019, the foundation, in partnership with Edlord Center US, drafted a bill for the right of Rivertube, which is ongoing now through the both national and state House of Assembly for passage into law. Ecological primacy. The notion that the long-term future human community as a part of larger life systems depend on living with ecological bounds and on orienting our activity to be as life-enhancing as possible become the core governance principle for the river and the ecosystems. This is our main activities at this moment. Ecological justice. The path toward ecological justice in the river system begin with integrated water resources management. Just a few months ago, we have proposed to establish an integrated institute for Rivertube, known as Rivertube Basin Institute, at Delta State Universities. Hopefully, this institute will be launched, will be inaugurated in September 27th this year to build the capacity of all stakeholders for us to achieve the purpose of balancing social, economic, and environmental interests on Rivertube basis. We also plan to inaugurate what is called Rivertube Global Memorandum of Understanding. This is a concept that involves all key stakeholders in the river basin, where all will come together and brainstorm for months. They come up with a strategy and agreement that this is the way they want Rivertube to be in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and 50 years. Such document will be signed, and a commitment from each stakeholder will be in that document that will guide everybody's actions, both from the lowest level of person, groups, society, community, business, and government. We also plan, in terms of reconnecting people to the Rivertube, to launch Rivertube annual festival weeks, where we hope to reconnect the youth who are now far away from Rivertube. We hope to launch under the Rivertube Festival Week, youth swimming competition, beauty contest, river walk, diving competition, and boating. It will be 7 days event, ending up with river symposiums and declarations. We hope, with this in mind, and applying the ecological law concept, we will overcome all difficulties, obstacles, to ensure that Rivertube stay for the present and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dafe, for, I think we can see from that the parallels of long legacies of colonialism, for example. Also, how power dynamics get reflected in constitutions, both in Nigeria and Brazil, and certainly in other countries. But thank you very much for that example. And so Pamela, over to you. Pamela's going to talk us about Pete the Moose and wildlife in Vermont and all kinds of things like that. Thank you, Pamela.
All right. I am also trying to share with you and hoping that you can see my extremely complex design of my first slide of this PowerPoint. Can you see that?
It's all good. Take it away.
Great. Wonderful. So thank you so much for being here today. My area is animal law, and I I've had a lot of fun along with my student Heidi Gunther so far trying to reimagine or reconstruct wildlife law, and specifically wildlife law in the state of Vermont as it pertains to moose. But I chose, instead of just any old moose, decided to use a story of a moose that was named Pete. And he was born and lived a short life in what is known as the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. It's extremely remote, and it is probably the area, if there's any one area of Vermont most likely to secede from the nation, it's going to be the Northeast Kingdom. But because not only the fact that Pete had a name, but because he was really a famous figure in Vermont for a while, and because there was much more complexity to the relationship between Pete the moose and the Vermont legislature and the Vermont Department of Natural Resources, I thought this really is a striking story for illustrating how our environmental, animal law, and other types of laws really don't work well together or even serve the purposes of this one animal. And so, well, that's what I want to do today. And from as far as the agenda goes, I want to just tell you a little bit about Pete's story and introduce some of the inconsistencies and the ways that regulations and value systems butted heads here. And then to try to go through some of the different areas of mostly state law that applied or was in some way invoked by this story. And then that should become pretty clear then what a disaster it was, a perfect storm it was under state law in this situation, and how the Vermont legislature kind of fumbled its way through this. Then I want to mention three of the principles of ecological law that I think are most relevant here, but these are the ones we're starting with developing. And because that's an aspirational goal, longer term, I want to just leave you with some of the proposals for kind of bridging the gap in animal law scholars and practitioners have suggested. So Pete was born in 2008, and the story goes that he was either discovered or taken in by a man named David Lawrence in the Northeast Kingdom. He was 72 at the time, didn't have much use for people, but had plenty of use for animals and basically lived off the grid. According to him, he rescued Pete as a calf and nursed him back to health after he'd been attacked by dogs. As Pete grew and started to mature into a young adolescent, he needed, David Lawrence thought he needed a place to remain confined because he thought that Pete would not be able to survive on his own in the wild, or he would not be afraid of humans enough to survive hunting season. Although when I met David Lawrence back in 2010 or so, it seemed to me like perhaps the biggest reason why he wanted to keep Pete close was that he really liked him. It was, he actually referred to him as his son and certainly his friend. They were buddies. He fed Pete all sorts of different types of foods that normally moose don't eat, which turned out to have pretty horrific consequences in the long run. But in any respect, he ironically found a place for Pete on a place called Big Rack Ridge in Irisburg, Vermont, owned by a man named Doug Nelson. Big Rack Ridge was one of two, at the time, remaining canned hunt or confined hunt facilities in the state of Vermont. These are large hundreds or even thousands of acres fenced in with wild animals that are usually fed and in that respect become kind of tame, and people can come and pay thousands of dollars to shoot and kill one of these animals. This particular one, Big Rack Ridge, was mostly an elk hunting facility. And honestly, this picture doesn't really do them justice. The antlers on these elk were just something to behold. I've never seen anything quite like it. But elk were that was the attraction. So he sold hunts, if you will, I have to put quotes around it, of elk and also of bison. And so this facility was about 600 to 700 acres. It was big enough for Pete to also be there. And so that's where Pete was confined. Now, importantly, the confined hunting facility was one of two that remained legal in Vermont. In 2008, the Department of Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Commission decided that it had the statutory authority to end canned hunting or confined hunting, but it grandfathered these two facilities in. At the same time, it also strengthened its laws on perimeter fencing, saying that it had to be, the fencing had to be able to keep a separation between the animals that are inside, that are to be hunted, and the animals on the outside of the fence that are hunted by hunters in Vermont, not in the facility. You see, this is a little strange, but there was a reason for that. And that was that by not having a fence with integrity to prevent wild animals from going in and out of the fence, it meant that Vermont's wildlife population could intermingle with the elk and the bison that were in Nelson's hunting facility. And these animals were imported to Vermont from out of state, and the big concern from Fish and Wildlife was chronic wasting disease. It's sort of, if you're not familiar with it, it's almost the equivalent of mad cow disease for wild animals. It's a neurological condition. It can't actually be discovered, or it can't be diagnosed rather without performing an autopsy. And so while an animal has it, it may be difficult to tell, but it spreads rapidly. And it spreads, one of the ways it can spread is through saliva, eating from a corn trough such as this. This is Nelson feeding the elk on his facility. So Fish and Wildlife didn't want these moose and deer coming into the elk hunting facility, and told Nelson that he needed to strengthen his fence and prepare for the deer and the moose inside the facility, the wild ones, to be exterminated by Fish and Wildlife. So that set in motion. Here's a picture of an autopsy of actually sampling, I believe it's brain tissue for chronic wasting disease. And so when elk were shot by clients of Big Rack Ridge, they would then send tissue off to be analyzed to make sure that there was no chronic wasting disease on site. All right, so what happened then? Now, Doug Nelson is, I assume, still a pretty politically powerful person in the Northeast Kingdom, certainly very business savvy. And David Lawrence didn't want his moose to be exterminated or shot by Fish and Wildlife. So thus was the beginning of a really impressive grassroots campaign, the Save Pete the Moose campaign. It started on social media. It started to take on, it got all sorts of national press. Kids on Saturdays would come, families would come on their pickup trucks and ride through this, by this facility to meet Pete the Moose, feed him here, feed him some bread. I mean, this was a thing. And so the Boston Globe and the Today Show and the New York Times and the Atlantic, and it was a curious story. Protect Pete the Moose, who's just, it's by no fault of his own, this friend of an old hermit in the Northeast Kingdom. He's going to be killed because of maybe there's a risk of chronic waste and disease, maybe there's not. It really put Department of Natural Resources and the governor and anybody else in a pretty bad position politically. And so that takes us to the next section here. What were the laws in play here? The one thing to remember more than anything else is that animals are property under US law. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what type of animal it is or what use it is. Beyond that, species and how we use them will dictate perhaps what types of protections we have for them. Peat was more than anything a natural resource. Natural resource law says that the animals and other inanimate objects, water bodies, minerals, rivers, etc., are natural resources. They are part of the public trust. They are public property, but the state manages them for our benefit. Peat could also be a game animal, and there are Fish and Wildlife actually is funded by hunting permits more than anything else in Vermont, and so in any other, if he were outside the fencing, he would be a game animal. If he would have agricultural laws would come into play, and so the state Department of Agriculture would have something to say about how his management. And then, of course, there's the fact that unlike any of the other types of law here, Dave Lawrence considered peat an individual, and that's the big difference between natural resources law, agriculture law, any of the other types of law here, is that they consider wildlife animals as one of many. They are not considered in the individual as an individual. And so what the campaign ultimately did was lead the legislature to really misstep and create something called, they slipped into an appropriations bill, the Nelson Amendment. They transferred ownership of peat and all the other wild animals in that facility to the private property. They called them a special purpose herd of the owner. And that caused all sorts of outrage among hunting groups and animal rights groups, you name it. A year later, the legislature reversed itself. It said, no, Pete's back to publicly owned natural resource, but we are issuing him a stay of execution. This was then Governor Shumlin that said he's not going to be exterminated. As it happened, he actually died in surgery. He had to have surgery to correct a hoof disease that he developed as a result of his poor diet of eating non-typical diet for moose, jelly donuts, candy bars, you name it. So he died. What lessons did we learn here in Vermont? Not a whole lot. This is an example of a moose that's been ravaged by winter ticks, which is a real problem all along the states here and then in Canada as well. That climate change is creating all sorts of extra concerns for for moose in all across the band of their general habitat. And so when looking quickly at some of the ecological principles that Heidi and I see is that, first of all, the need to expand programs of research and monitoring, that's so obvious, and perhaps no more so than how the Department of Natural Resources just this year has decided to handle the winter tick problem. It decided that the way to control the tick population, which was devastating moose, was to actually sell more moose hunting permits. The fewer moose there would be, the reasoning goes, the fewer ticks. To me, this seems like an inadequate solution, and one that suggests we should be increasing our understanding of how to protect them. Consistency evaluation has to permeate all areas of the law, and not just valuing a moose based on how we humans use them. And of course, because moose know no boundaries, that both in the United States and across into the Canadian border, a border I cannot wait to cross this summer. This is going to be the third principle that we've discussed. Finally, quickly, I just want to mention that there are some really interesting ideas out there in animal law. A woman by the name of Karen Bradshaw has written, she's written this book called Wildlife as Property Owners. I've also included here a 2018 law review article where she suggests that wildlife animals should be awarded their own property interests in their habitat. And so they would be legally enforceable. Really fascinating read, I suggested. Also, other proposals have suggested that if we amend the Endangered Species Act to allow citizen standing, give the real beneficiaries of the Endangered Species Act the right to be able to assert their rights. That's something that Stacey Gordon-Sterling had suggested. I suggest also that we apply those similar principles to state natural resources law, that is, make public trust law actually have some bite, some real meaning. Ultimately, unless they become something more than just inanimate property, moose are going to, as with other wildlife animals, really be they're not going to become anywhere close to what we imagine under ecological law principles. And this is a 2010 article by David Favor about the concept of creating a new category of property called living property, and that would include animals. And with that, I'll leave it to you, and thank you so much for this. Please contact me if you have any questions or suggestions. I look forward to hearing now the true fifth presentation.
Thanks very much, Pamela, for yet another example that shows the diversity of the context in which we're looking at these ideas, and for drawing attention to how property is so central to some of the issues we're talking about. And you talk about new ways of rights for animals through the river Ethiop. We saw that with rights of rivers. So the rights of nature is certainly something that's relevant. So thank you very much for that. We'll now turn back to the Mohawk community at Ganawake, which has been affected so much by the St. Lawrence Seaway. So I guess Gab and Larissa, back to you.
Amazing. All right, so we are going to try and quickly go through our case study. So our case study is centered on the St. Lawrence Seaway and its impacts on Ganawage. We're hoping to study the impact of the seaway and develop a framework to understand ecological restoration from an ecological law perspective. Ecological law understands human law as an integral part of ecology and rather than standing outside of it. Now, while ecological lawyers often draw inspiration from indigenous legal traditions and the interdependence of all life and on law from the land, we think that there is not enough appreciation first that because of this interdependence, damage caused to rivers is also social and cultural harm. And second, that indigenous leadership is crucial in developing legal frameworks for managing the health of rivers and the healing of socio-cultural harms associated with environmental degradation.
Yeah, we're having a little trouble. Are others having trouble seeing the screen now?
Yes.
Oh, is it back?
No, it's okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, so we're going to be working in partnership with some community partners. So the Kanien'kehá:ka Language and Cultural Center to hopefully to better understand the cultural and social harms that came with the St. Lawrence Seaway, and also the Ganawage Environmental Protection Office. I believe Lynn Jacobs is actually on the call with us. She's the director of the Environmental Protection Office, and so she's obviously a lot more knowledgeable than we are about the impacts that the seaway has had on the ecology around Ganawage, and also, as we'll talk a bit later in the presentation, of the restoration efforts that are being done in the community. So just to caveat, Our case study is still in the very early stages of our research. So we're still working with our community partners to figure out or to nail down a final version of our research agreements and our research objectives. So in our presentation, we'll go through a bit of the history of the seaway. We'll talk briefly about the restoration efforts that are ongoing and the concepts of redress in Canadian settler law, but then also how we might start trying to reimagine, reconceptualize redress within an ecological law lens. And then we'll talk about a bit about our research objectives for now. But yeah, I just want to make the caveat that we're still working with our community partners, so all of this might be subject to change, so we can figure out something that works best for all of us. So a quick little history of the seaway. So over the last few centuries, Indigenous land has been progressively taken or destroyed by the Canadian government, which I'm sure most of the folks on this call know of. The construction of transportation networks in particular, including railways and seaways, have historically been crucial to the development of the Canadian nation state. This infrastructure was constructed disproportionately on the lands of Indigenous populations. Canada continues to actively partake in these development projects in pursuit of nation building, capital gains, and energy harvesting. Now, the St. Lawrence Seaway is one such project, and we can see a picture of it, or part of it, because it's a very large project here on the slides. It was built in the 1950s by Canada and the United States after decades of negotiations. And it's composed of a series of channels, dams, and locks between Montreal and Lake Erie that not only generate hydroelectricity, but also facilitate access to the Great Lakes for international trade. As a result of the construction, tens of thousands of acres of land were flooded in Ontario, in Quebec, and in the state of New York. And thousands of people in communities were displaced by this flooding. So despite the fact that numerous communities were impacted by the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway, and a lot of ecosystems were disrupted, our case study will focus on the impacts it had on the Canadian Gahaga community of Ganawage, which is located just on the south shore of Montreal. For Ganawage, the seaway is a recent story of expropriation by the federal government in what is a generally long history of theft. This expropriation occurred despite Aboriginal title being recognized and protected in the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Quebec Act of 1774. In 1954, the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway took place along the northern part of Ganawage's territory, removing 10% of its land base. Over 1,300 acres of Ganawage's land located in the residential and historic center of the community was expropriated for the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And once the construction of the La Prairie Dike was completed, the community was entirely cut off from the river. And so it lost its historical center and easy access to the river, and it completely changed, as these pictures demonstrate, the ecology that the community was living within. So the construction of the seaway obviously had significant environmental impacts on the ecosystems surrounding Ganawage. It radically changed the landscape and the waterscape by flooding large swaths of land and creating a new seaway channel where there were once rapids. This resulted in the erasure of natural coastline, swamps, islands. It led to many plants and animals disappearing from the area, as well as an increased level of toxins in the water, which inevitably bled into the fish that are still here. So the seaway had numerous impacts, not only on the ecosystem and on the community. And what we're hoping to explore in our case study is obviously the interconnectedness between the ecological harms and also the social cultural harms, and then also how we go about trying to conceptualize legal redress within this framework where yeah, within this framework where these projects are mega projects and have been built decades ago and realistically aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And if Larissa has joined us, I'll let her continue to talk about redress and restoration.
So before we get into our project, it's worth noting that since the construction of the seaway, the federal government has undertaken kind of two broad forms of redress. First, they provided some compensation, I stress some, for the losses that the community and ecosystems have incurred. So after the expropriation of lands, the federal government did give residents compensation, but they were really according to painfully rigid and insufficient formulas that were simply based on number of land acres lost. More recently in 2020, the Ganawage Environment Protection Office received funds to partially cover $2 million costs of their restoration projects in the bay on the island. And this project's really exciting. It aims to improve water flow in the bay, diversify wildlife habitat, naturalize the shoreline to improve the landscape for the wildlife and community members, and protect and enhance existing natural wetlands. And so we'll be working with the Environment Department and the Cultural Center to, get a better sense of exactly, how the project is going and understand the impacts for the community as well. And so I'm going to ask Gab to just click on the next slide. So our project, like with the history in mind, of the St. Lawrence Seaway and the knowledge that in today's world, there are many communities and landscapes confronted with, large scale environmental and cultural damage now. Our project stems from a simple question, and it's how should the law respond to environmental, social, and cultural harm that has occurred and continues to occur by today's systems? And they're forward and backward looking principles of justice surrounding this question. So while backwards is concerned with settling past grievances and providing reparations, forward aspects seek to improve relationships and trust among the parties involved. So in this case, Indigenous communities and the government, but also prevent these kinds of harms from happening again. And so in combining these ideas, our project really aims to explore a new feature in ecological law, one grounded in healing, and yeah, it would provide redress for both the past, but also, redress in a transforming sense to prevent harm in the future. Since we don't have any results yet, we thought we would go through our specific research objectives and just kind of, talk about the project and what we know so far. First, as Gab mentioned, we're really seeking to understand the types of cultural, social, and environmental harms, the intricacies of this harm, and how interconnected it all is caused by the seaway on the Mohawks of Ganawage. And this work will be informed by interviews in the community, and it'll give us a sense of what types of redress are required, what redress has been given, and what really, what redress is on the horizon. And we'll also be wanting to understand more about this restoration project that's ongoing. Once again, informed by community needs and interview data, we'll be looking to understand exactly how things are progressing and really look at what the government has done so far and what through ecological law might redress look like in the future. And so this brings us to kind of our deconstruct and reconstruct themes that you've heard throughout all the case studies. Here, we're really looking to deconstruct how the harm is created and sustained. And that also ties into the redress that we've aforementioned. So what else needs to be done? In the background of all of this is a recognition that there is a plethora of federal and provincial laws and policies that really permitted and legitimized the engineering of the waterfront in Ganawage, and it undermined the community's self-determination. And so although there are specific laws that enabled the construction of the seaway, and we can challenge things like the expropriation law and of course the Indian Act, there's really a whole system of laws working together that led to it too. Property rights, investment law, international trade, contract law, and in a sense, deconstruction here really focuses on the entire long-standing and systemic colonial underpinnings of the entire system and that have affected the region. And you know, all of this would be, you know, really intimately connected to how we consider harm as well as how we move forward. And so, I mean, part of our deconstruction work here will be to show that, you know, the holistic nature of all of this and how an ecological lens would really prevent this in the future. And finally, to reconstruct the case through the principles of ecological law, we've heard from other teams like ecocentrism, ecological primacy, and ecological justice. We'll be looking at the case study through a new lens, but beyond the existing principles, as we've mentioned, we'd really like to add a new one about redress and healing. And we really feel it is indispensable in light of, you know, the past and ongoing harms caused by development all over Canada and the world. And yeah, so we're excited to present it, and we are still in early stages, but we're excited to talk soon when we have more interview data done.
Thank you so much, Larissa and Gab, and to all of the teams for really laying out the diversity, again, the diversity of the situations we're looking at. And also, I know I found from today's presentation just a new sense of some of the common themes that we're dealing with. I'm sitting in Western New York, very near the Kinsua Dam, which was another big government project that had a profound impact on another nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Seneca Nation. Very similar, and as we know, there are so many examples. So having an example like the Seaway and its impacts on Kahnawake, it's a deep dive not only in there, but into issues that affect many other places, as Larissa said, in not only in Canada, but around the world. So we were seeing these emerging themes of the impacts of a lot of the law we're deconstructing is settler law and that carries with it legacies of colonialism. And that's certainly, I think, a theme that we'll be looking at. The teams are now working to reach some more concrete results, share their work with each other, and do some sort of internal peer review with a view of publishing these case studies in some form by the end of the year. So we're looking forward to doing that and presenting that to our audience. And we welcome feedback with regard to the project as a whole or any of our particular case studies. So feel free to contact us through the Leadership for the Ecozoic Project or the Ecological Law and Governance Association. We have a minute for a thought or two, a question or two, if anyone would like to jump in here.
I just want to quick comments, say how incredibly exciting it is to see so many concrete analyses of how of cases under ecological law principles and how to move towards a really reimagining of law as ecological law. It's fabulous. Congratulations to everyone for the work. And just a quick question, especially related or inspired, I guess, by these large dam and the Seaway projects and the consequences of this. It just occurred to me that we are at a moment right now that so many large projects with this Build Back Better concept could be happening. And so I'm just curious whether any of the researchers here are trying to also feed these lessons into any concrete projects that may be in the horizon that could be pretty harmful, and to hopefully make them less harmful.
Yeah, well, bringing this work out is a real challenge. We do have the example of Untitled, where at least that project is stalled, and all the way to Kahnawake, where you know the prospect for completely undoing a very harmful project seem very slim, and yet there is this need for healing and redress. Would anyone like to jump in and share some thoughts on that from any of the teams? Yeah, maybe that's a big question that I think we can all be thinking about. You know, the leadership for the Ecozoic project does have a policy project, which is really designed, and we're working with them to try to see, you know, near-term opportunities to affect policy. But so much of ecological law is a very long-term vision. So I think part of doing these case studies is to put that long-term vision, to create a continuum and a trajectory and a pathway that we can start on as soon as possible, including, as I think Carla is very aptly telling us, with some of the projects that are going to emerge as we come out of the pandemic. And there's this building probably makes many of us on this call feel a bit nervous when we look at how building has happened in the past. We're out of time. I do want to thank all of you who are here for joining us, and to remind you that the webinar series will continue next month with a webinar hosted by the Center for Environmental Ethics and Law and the Ethics Specialist Group of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law on crisis in global ethics and the future of global governance, obviously related to what we're talking about here. So please join us for that. And again, thanks to all the teams and to all of us who joined us, all of you who joined us today for this webinar. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon or evening wherever you are.